Well, joining us this morning as our speaker is Dr. David Sumner. Welcome, Dr. Sumner. We're very glad that you were here. Dr. Sumner is a professor. I'm really on one today. He's a professor of English and Environmental Studies at Linfield University. He teaches courses in American literature, philosophy and literature, American nature writing, and Western American literature. Professor Sumner has published in the fields of American literature, literature and the environment, rhetoric, and writing pedagogy. His work is particularly focused on the issues of literature and ethics. And I imagine that he's going to bring a little bit about literature to us this morning. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sumner.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always fun to come here. I grew up in Salt Lake City. I grew up going to the Mormon church. I even served in the Mormon mission, actually, as a young man. And I left Mormonism in my 20s. And it's so refreshing to come to such an open place. It does my heart good. So thanks for inviting me. I appreciate coming here. It's also really, it's fun to come back here. It feels like coming to visit friends. I want to thank Chris and Pat and Ken for the communication and the invitation. It's fun to see former students. It's fun to see other friends. So I really appreciate that. As has been advertised, I'm going to speak a little bit about literature today. And the title of my sermon, it sounds so strange, is Literature as Equipment for Living. And this idea is taken from a favorite rhetorician of mine, a guy named Kenneth Burke. But I want to start with another favorite writer of mine, Henry David Thoreau. And in the introduction to one of his famous essays called Walking, he writes, "I wish to speak a word for nature, for absolute freedom and wildness. There are enough champions of civilization. The minister and the school committee and every one of you will take care of that." So I'm going to take a little bit of liberty, and I want to say today I wish to speak a word for literature and for absolute freedom and wildness of reading. TikTok, Netflix, Facebook, Snapgram, and the tech billionaires and all their algorithms will take care of that. And why would I need to speak for literature? The first thing is that I've got to ask is, it's just made up stories. Why would this be important? To quote my father-in-law, is that true or is that just a yarn? When he said that to me, I didn't even know how to respond, I'll be honest with you. And after all, if you have read Plato's Republic, in the Republic, Plato he wants to kick the poets out of the Republic because he worries about the poets are going to appeal to the emotions and not appeal to reason. And the appeals to the emotion can be misleading and can lead us away from truth. And I think Plato is right to a degree, but appeals to the emotion can also lead us to deeper truth, and it can also lead us to deeper emotions and deeper understanding. And today I want to focus on the idea of empathy and how literature can lead us to empathy and how it can help us to vicariously experience things that we don't have to experience in our own lives, which is a bonus. Because it can broaden our experience, and it also can allow us to not have to suffer the consequences or that kind of thing of different kinds of action. It can also help us to inhabit people who we would never encounter in our own narrow lives, and even the broadest of lives is narrow. And to understand through the imagination of some brilliant writer what it might feel like to be that human being, and what it might feel like to inhabit their life. And finally, I would argue that one of the key things that literature can teach us is humility. And humility, to me, is the most important thing that we can learn. I would argue, for me, my core principle is that I know I can be wrong. It's that I'm fallible. And that if we had more humility and fallibility in more recognition of our own human fallibility, we would have less war, we would have less conflict, we would have less selfishness, we would have less poverty. These kinds of things that I think are embodied within the values of this fellowship. So I only have 2.5 hours worth of things to say, but I'll try to keep it. I'll try to keep it shorter than that. So, and again, why do I need to make an argument for literature? Well, my guess is you all sense that people are reading less, and that literature is holding less of an important part in our society. And this can be documented statistically. If you look at English majors in college, since 2000, I finished my PhD in the year 2000, and I had perfect timing to finish a PhD in English because that's right when English majors started to decline. So I was thinking ahead. And in 2016, they've just started to drop off a cliff. So the ability for us to convince students why they should read and why something like an English major would prepare them for life is a difficult argument right now. It's really a difficult thing to do. I was reading The Atlantic. This just came 3 days ago, and this is an article by Rose Horowitz, and it's called "The Elite College Students Who Can't Read Books." And this is just the beginning of it, just to let you know that I'm not making this stuff up. Nicholas Dames has taught literature humanities at Columbia University, a required Great Books course since 1988. He loves his job, but it has changed. Over the past decades, students have become overwhelmed by the reading. College kids have never read everything they are assigned. We all know that. You guys have probably had that situation in your own lives. You try or you don't try, but they used to read a little more. Of course, but this feels different. Dame's students now seem bewildered by the thought of finishing multiple books a semester. His colleagues have noticed the same problem. Many students no longer arrive at college, even highly selective elite colleges, prepared to read books. This development puzzled Dames until one day during the fall 2022 semester, when a first-year student came to his office hours to share how challenging she had found the early assignments. Lit Hume is what they call this course, often requires students to read a book, sometimes a very long and dense one, in just a week or two. But the student told Dames that at her public high school, she had never been required to read an entire book. She had been assigned excerpts, poetry, news articles, but not a single book cover to cover. And I think that there are a lot of reasons, and I'm not blaming our students, and I'm not blaming, I'm not blaming the people that are struggling with this, because they didn't create the world in which they exist where this is the case. But I do think it's a problem that we need to think about and address. And I don't think it's a problem because there aren't other valuable ways to spend your time, and there aren't other valuable things to do. But I do think that literary engagement and long-term, concentrated, thoughtful engagement with a single text offer a certain kind of intellectual outcome, a certain kind of intellectual reward, and depth of understanding that can't be gleaned from shorter-term kind of engagement. And I've noticed the same thing in my own students, but what I'm here to do today is to encourage you guys to do it more. And as a guy who reads for a living, I read fewer and fewer books for pleasure now, unfortunately. So I am a victim as well, because there are so many things that can take us away. There are so many easier things to do. And so I've noticed this in my own life. And so I think that we need to be diligent in thinking, how are we spending that time? And I don't know if you've noticed this, but when I say, wait a minute, just start. Once I start, I realize the joy of it, and I'm back to it. And I realize that this is really what I want to do, but getting started is not always easy in that. But that being said, it's not just, I want to talk a little bit about, before I get into some concrete examples about this, I want to talk a little bit about my theory of reading. And here's a quote by a guy named John Rogers. And he says, because not all books are created equal, let's just admit this. And I would never discourage anybody from reading anything. I am for free and broad reading. But I would argue the problem is when people just read a few things. You need to read broadly and have context. John Rogers writes, there are two novels that can change a bookish 14-year-old's life, The Lord of the Rings and Atlas Shrugs. One is a childish fantasy that often engenders a lifelong obsession with its unbelievable heroes, leading to an emotionally stunted, socially crippled adulthood, unable to deal with the real world. The other, of course, involves orcs. And I would never discourage somebody from reading Atlas Shrugged, although I completely object to the moral world that offers. But I see reading as a Seurat painting. And I don't know how many of you all have gone to the Chicago Art Institute. But have any of you been to the Chicago Art Institute? Yeah. So you walk into the main gallery, right? And there's this giant Seurat in the main gallery, and it's probably the size of that back wall, right? It's an enormous painting. And it's Sunday afternoon on the Isle of La Grande Jatte, I think is how you say it. And I don't speak French. I learned Spanish and Anglo-Saxon, and so my French is not great. But if you look at the painting, it's a beautiful big painting, but if you go up close to the painting, it's painted in a fashion called pointillism. And a pointillist painting, so if you look at it, it's pixelated. And there'll be blue dots and red dots and yellow dots. So if you're really close, all you see is those dots. But as you pull away from the painting, you see all of a sudden the scene begins to appear. And all of a sudden you see this beautiful scene of the 19th century of people on the bank of the river in their Sunday outfits, enjoying the afternoon. And I would argue that reading is like this. If you only read Atlas Shrugged, you're looking at a blue dot. But what you need to do is you need to read Atlas Shrugged and Huckleberry Finn and Beloved and The Whitest Teeth and poetry and drama and all kinds of things. And you need to read 100 and 500 and 1,000 other things. And as you do so, you're able to pull back and you're able to see the whole of what it is. And it's that lifetime, that large engagement that gives you these big benefits from literature. So as I tell my students that they're just beginning this process, and this has to be a lifelong process to give them the wisdom that they need, to give them the understanding, to give them the empathy that they need. Okay, so this is literature, this is Theory of Literature by Dave. The other thing, and I want to save some time for some questions, so I want to give you a couple of examples of why I think literature can change our mind and can change the way that we see the world. And the first example I want to point to is one of my favorite books within the American canon, which is Huckleberry Finn. And Huckleberry Finn is, why do I love Huckleberry Finn so much? I love Huckleberry Finn not only because it, as I think Hemingway was correct when he said this is where American literature begins. And American literature begins at Huckleberry Finn because it's the first real reckoning with the American original sin, which is that of slavery. And it's the first time in a broadly published, widely read book where an African-American man is made fully human. And if you look at this book, we have Jim as a two-dimensional character in Huck's mind at the beginning of the book, and is a full-fledged, three-dimensional human being by the end of the text. And this is written in 1880. This is not a time of great tolerance in our, this is right after Reconstruction has fallen apart and Jim Crow has come into the South. This is at a time where where we're still suffering from the Civil War has been over, but not for very long. This is a time when we still have all of the problems of race that we still do as well. Things have changed for the better. It's not that racial problems don't exist, but the intensity of the racial problems were still there. And one of the most important writers in America comes up with this character, Huckleberry Finn, as a way to get us to reckon with this problem that we have. And the brilliance of this book is we have this naive 14-year-old boy, and there's this distance between us as readers who understand that Huck does not understand the world the way we understand the world. And it's through the distance between his naivete and our understanding that we get the empathy and that we get what's going on. And for me, the best part of this text comes near the end. And by the way, at the end, the ending is terrible. I would argue that Twain has a brilliant book until the very end, and then he totally drops the ball, but that's a whole different lecture. And Huck, the King and the Duke, have just sold Jim back into slavery. And Huck doesn't know what to do about it. And Huck is distraught. And I'm going to use, the N-word is used frequently here. I'm going to substitute the word slave in for N-word. And I'm just going to read a little bit, and I want us to think about this. And if we have time, and we may not, I'm going to move on to Toni Morrison, but I'm not sure we're going to have time, so that might be saved for later. Once I said to myself, it would be 1,000 times better for Jim to be a slave at home where his family was, as long as he's got to be a slave. And so I better write a letter to Tom Sawyer and tell him to tell Miss Watson where he was. But I soon give up that notion for two things. She'd be mad and disgusted at his rascality and his ungratefulness for leaving her. And so she'll sell him straight down the river again. And if she didn't, everybody naturally despises an ungrateful slave. And they'd make Jim feel it all the time. And so he'd feel ornery and disgraced. And then think of me. It would get all around that Huck Finn helped a slave to get his freedom. And if I was to ever see anybody from that town again, I'd be ready to get down and lick his boots for shame. That's just the way. A person does a low-down thing, and then he don't want to take no consequences of it. Thinks as long as he can hide it, and it ain't no disgrace. That was my fix exactly. The more I studied about this, the more my conscience was getting to grinding me, and the more wicked and low-down and ornery I felt. And at last, when it hit me all of a sudden, and at last it hit me all of a sudden, that here was the plain hand of Providence slapping me in the face and letting me know my wickedness was being watched all the time from up there in heaven, whilst I was stealing a poor old woman's slave that hadn't never done me no harm, and now was showing me there's one that's always on the lookout and ain't a-going to allow no such miserable doings to go only just so fur and no further. I most dropped in my tracks. I was so scared. Well, I tried the best I could to kinder soften it up some for myself by saying I was brung up to be wicked, and so I weren't much to blame, but something inside me kept saying there was Sunday school. You could have gone to it. And if you'd done that, you'd learnt. And people there would tell you how to act, and told you how to act about slaves, and now you're going to everlasting fire. It made me shiver, and I about made up my mind to pray. And this is important because Huck loves Jim, but Huck really feels he has done the wrong thing by helping Jim escape, and he really feels he's going to go to hell because he did this. It made me shiver, and I about made up my mind to pray and see if I couldn't try to quit being the kind of boy I was and be better. So I kneeled down, but the words wouldn't come. Why wouldn't they? It weren't no use to try and hide it from him, nor from me neither. I knowed very well why they wouldn't come. It was because my heart weren't right. It was because I weren't square. It was because I was playing double. I was letting on to give up sin, but away inside of me, I was holding on to it, to the biggest one of all. I was trying to make my mouth say I would do the right thing. and the clean thing, and go and write to that slave's owner and tell where he was, but deep down in me, I knowed it was a lie. And he knowed it, and you can't pray a lie. I found that out. So I was full of trouble, full as I could be, and I didn't know what to do. And at last I had an idea. And I says, I'll go and write a letter, and then see if I can pray. Why, it was astonishing the way I felt. Light as a feather, right straight off, and my troubles all gone. So I got a piece of paper and a pencil, all glad and excited, and sat down and wrote, Miss Watson, your runaway slave Jim is down here 2 miles below Pikesville, and Mr. Phelps has got him, and he will give him up for the reward you send. Huck Finn. I felt good and all washed clean from sin for the first time I'd ever felt so in my life, and I knowed I could pray now. But I didn't do it straight off. But I laid the paper down and I sat there thinking of how good it was all this happened. So how near I'd come to being lost and going to hell. And went on thinking and got to thinking over the trip down the river. And I see Jim before me all the time, in the day and in the nighttime, sometimes in the moonlight, sometimes in the storm. And when we was floating along, talking and singing and laughing, but somehow I couldn't seem to strike no place to harden my heart against him. But only the other kind. I'd see him standing my watch on top of his'n instead of calling me so I could go on sleeping. And I'd see how glad he was when I come back out of the fog and when I come to him again in the swamp, up there where the feud was and such like times, and would always call me honey and pet me and do everything he could to think of for me. And how good he always was. And at last, I struck the time he saved me by the time I saved him by telling the men we had smallpox aboard. And he was so grateful and said I was the best friend old Jim ever had in the world, and the only one he's got now. And then I happened to look around and see that paper. It was a close place. I took it up and held it in my hand. I was trembling because I'd got to decide, forever betwixt two things, and I noted. I studied a minute, sort of holding my breath, and then says to myself, all right then, I'll go to hell. And I tore it up. It was awful thoughts and awful words, but they was said. And I let them stay said and never thought no more about reforming. I shoved the whole thing out of my head, and I said I would take up wickedness again, which was in my line, being brought up to it, and the other weren't. For starters, I would go to work to steal Jim out of slavery again, and if I could think of anything worse, I would do that too, because as long as I was in for good. I might as well go in whole hog. So I think we all sense that Huck was doing the right thing. But as we read that, and as we read the experience of this 14-year-old boy, we understand the change of heart that he has. And to have written that to a racist America in 1880, and to present this problem to those folks, but to write that to a racist America in 2024, it still rings, and it still helps us understand those problems. Anyway, I've got more to say. I'm out of time, and I want to save some time for questions. Let me just say something in closing. I was going to talk about Beloved and Setha and our understanding that was gained from that, and then I was going to talk about King Lear and Antigone, and obviously I was way more ambitious than we have time for. But what I'd like to say is one of the main things that literary tragedy teaches us is humility. And we have two ways to really deal with the world. One is comic, which is where we have problems but we come back together, and one is tragic, where we have problems and we maintain our pride and everything goes to shit. And so I would hope that we can all embrace the lesson of good tragedy, which is humility, and that instead we can choose comedy. And I would argue that if maybe Putin or Sinwar or Netanyahu had read Antigone or Lear or Hamlet or 1,000 Acres or House of Sand and Fog or some of these others, that maybe they would have thought twice. And I hope that we can. So thank you.
Wow.